All right, today we're going to dive into one of Christianity's oldest and most interesting debates: should we baptize infants? We're going to walk through the step-by-step case laid out in the book, Covenant Faithfulness. So let's jump right in.
So, the big question, who should be baptized? I mean, this has been a point of division in the church for like centuries. The book we're looking at today doesn't just give an opinion. It builds this really structured theological case from the ground up. Let's see how they do it.
Okay, before we go any further, we've got to get the key terms straight. The whole debate really boils down to two big ideas. On one side, you've got paedobaptism. That's baptizing the infant children of believers. And on the other side, there's credobaptism, which says, nope, baptism is only for people who can make a personal profession of faith.
The way this book lays out its case, it's almost like a legal argument, and we're going to follow that exact roadmap. First, we'll see why this whole thing matters so much. Then we'll get into the foundational idea they call the covenant household. After that, we'll look back at the Old Testament sign of circumcision and see how that sets the stage for baptism, which brings us right to the big conclusion.
All right, so why all the fuss? I mean, why does this question matter so much? According to the author of Covenant Faithfulness, this is way more than just a debate about a church ritual. The stakes are actually a lot higher than you might think.
And here's the central claim. The book argues that baptism isn't some matter of personal preference. It says it touches upon the very nature of the covenant of grace. What does that mean? Well, it means that how you answer the baptism question says a whole lot about how you understand God's core promise of salvation. It's not some side issue, it's foundational. So, where do they even start building this case? Well, the entire argument really stands on this one core concept, the covenant household. And this principle is all about how God relates to families and to groups, not just to isolated individuals. The fancy theological term for this is federal headship. But you can think of it like this. One person, a representative or a head, acts for an entire group. And whatever that representative does, well, it has real binding consequences for everyone they represent, whether that's a single family or, all of humanity. Now, the book doesn't just pull this out of thin air. It points to Scripture, like Romans 5, to back it up. In that passage, Adam is shown as the representative head for all of us. His one act of sin had consequences that rippled out to everyone. So definitely keep this idea of a representative head in your mind, because it's pretty much the key that unlocks the whole rest of the argument.
Okay, so we've got this principle of a representative head, right? The book then goes, where can we see this in action in the Bible? And it turns to the Old Testament for a really clear example, a physical sign that was applied to a whole household because of the faith of its head. And that precedent? It's circumcision.
So when the book breaks down circumcision back in Genesis 17, it points out 5 really important things. You see this pattern, right? It's commanded by God, it's a sign of His covenant, and it was applied to the entire household. But here are the 2 points that are absolutely crucial for this argument. It was specifically given to infants, just 8 days old. And, obviously, it was done way before they could ever have personal faith. And this is the real linchpin of the whole historical argument. In the Old Covenant, the sign of God's promise was clearly, explicitly applied to babies. It wasn't some reward for their faith, it was a mark that showed they were part of the covenant household, given to them long before they could ever believe for themselves. And this precedent is about to become super important.
Which brings us right to the heart of the whole thing. How does this Old Covenant practice of circumcision connect to the New Covenant practice of baptism? Well, the book argues that the Bible itself makes this connection, and it's not trying to be subtle about it.
The book zeroes in on this passage from Colossians chapter 2. They actually call it the explicit connection. And you can see why, right? Paul goes straight from talking about a circumcision made without hands directly into being buried with him in baptism. The argument here is that he's not just making a loose comparison. Paul is basically identifying baptism as the New Covenant's version of circumcision. And when you put them side by side, the book argues there's this direct one-to-one match. They're both a sign and seal of the covenant. They both signify sin being dealt with. Both were given to entire households. So the argument concludes that the prerequisite for both is exactly the same. Not a personal profession of faith, but just being a member of that covenant household. All right, so we've seen the core principle. We've looked at the historical precedent, and we've seen the connection made in the New Testament. Now the book ties it all together for its final conclusion. And it all comes down to one word: continuity. So here's the whole argument in a nutshell. If God's covenant of grace is one single continuous thing, and if children were without a doubt included in its sign in the Old Testament, then they should still be included in its sign in the New. I mean, unless there's a verse somewhere that explicitly says to kick them out.
So the book basically flips the script. It says the burden of proof isn't on finding a command to start baptizing infants. It's on finding a command to stop including them.
And this is where the book leaves us, with a pretty powerful, provocative question. It points right to the Apostle Peter's sermon in Acts, where he says the promise is for you and for your children. And then it throws down the challenge. If God's promise itself explicitly includes the children of believers, then who are we to withhold the sign of that promise from them? It's a really strong final thought that just kind of wraps up the entire argument for covenant faithfulness.